This is KHOI 89.1 Story City Ames, and you're listening to I Am Able Iowa, where we discuss the ability and disability. I'm Nancy Baker Curtis, public school teacher, board president for the ARC of Iowa, and parent advocate. I will be your host for today. I am joined by my co-host, Zach Meekum, who comes to us from Allies in Advocacy. Today, we have a really interesting topic, and I am so excited to introduce our guest. Our guest is Lish Greiner. Am I saying that correctly?
Sorry, it's Greiner.
Greiner. I apologize.
Yes,
Thank you
that's
for
okay.
correcting. Lish Greiner. And Lish, can you just go ahead and kind of share a little bit about yourself and who you are and what your work centers on today?
Sure. You said my name is Lish, and I am a neurodivergent parent. I am raising a neurodivergent child, and I also raised a few neurotypical children. And but my experience as an undiagnosed neurodivergent, both as a parent and as having an undiagnosed child, is what my work centers around today, and helping other people gain an understanding of neurodivergence.
I absolutely love that. I think today we're so much more open to the idea that, the world is a spectrum, right?
Hmm.
And we all are experiencing it from our own unique place on the spectrum. So I absolutely love that. Um, you've described your life before your before your diagnosis as exhausting, confusing, and filled with self-blame. I know a little bit about self-blame. Um, and so I'm just wondering, what did daily life feel like for you in those years before understanding that you were neurodivergent?
Yeah, it was just a tough all around. I am 44 years old now. I was 42 years old when I was diagnosed with ADHD and autism. And my daughter was 13 when she was diagnosed with ADHD initially. And our life before that was just really tough. Every day was a struggle. Every day was crying, meltdowns, struggling to make it through the day without any really reason, if that makes sense. We have, a normal life as far as like, we have a lot of privileges. My wife and I have good jobs, things like that. So there was no real kind of like thing you could point at to suggest like what it was that we were having such a hard time with. And so subsequently, neither could anybody else, and so we were just struggling to get by. So every day looked like a lot of struggling. And because we didn't have the right words or the right lens, the reason it felt so exhausting was not just because of the struggle. It was because without the lens and without the words, you turn to the only words you have. And so for me, that meant a lot of like trying to get better. The words that I had were that, I was lazy or
Mhm.
um, reactive or, and so I spent a solid decade dedicating my life to trying to feel better. And so I had every healthy practice out there. And I didn't just like do it. I was like obsessed with it. So I spent every day waking up at 4 a.m., doing a really dedicated, yoga practice, healthy eating, meditating, hiking, doing everything. So that's one reason it was really felt exhausting. I was exhausting myself trying to feel better. And in the end, those things were very, harmful. But I was obsessed and I dedicated a large part of my life for a solid decade to trying to feel, better.
Um, Thank you very much. I mean, that was very concise. Like, you, radio show's over. You explained the whole situation. Um, but my question for you is: it seems like there's this before and after, right? There's before your daughter was diagnosed, before you were diagnosed, you were miserable, and after you're now, I'm assuming less exhausted, less um angry.
Less crying. There's so much less
Yes.
crying. Yes.
And so my question is that just because you now have a vocabulary to understand these things, or were
Yes.
there, yes, um,
I feel that way. I feel um, very strongly that just understanding it changed our lives.
can
And
you,
I'll expand on that if you want me to.
yes,
I'll tell you exactly why. Because if you feel like your child is defiant or lazy or, in control of their reactions, then you're thinking and responding in that way. You're responding as if, even if you do it trauma informed, but your thoughts and your words are about how do I, fix this, or how do I get my child to not be defiant? And so when you have an understanding that they're not defiant, that rather they're experiencing threat responses or meltdowns or overwhelm, your thoughts and your actions and your words are different. And that changes your relationship. Does that answer it?
that's really helpful. I think time to illustrate this, I think you're absolutely right. I 100% agree. Um, could you maybe provide an example that illustrates this?
Yes. I'll tell you, interestingly, the first example, though, that I'm thinking of doesn't relate to parenting, but it's a great example. And it relates to personal relationships. And it's a story about my wife and I. And so one thing that my daughter and I both struggle with, which is a vocabulary word that we don't have very often, for people that are neurodivergent, specifically, typically with people that have ADHD, it's something called rejection sensitivity dysphoria, RSD for short. And Attitude Magazine did some science and said that 100% of people with ADHD experience RSD. What their experience is, of course, obviously differs. But that's kind of the whole point of my information about the vocabulary is like, to me, if you get a diagnosis of ADHD, they should be like, hey, and here's these things that you will experience. It's not just attention and hyperactivity, but here's, something else, RSD, rejection sensitivity dysphoria, because 100% of people with ADHD are experiencing it. And so for me, I was experiencing it a lot, and it was creating a lot of problems in my personal relationship with my spouse. And over the course of years, it just caused us a lot of grief. We didn't know what it was. We didn't have, a word for it. Um, I had two responses to RSD, and one is very reactive, but another response that I get to RSD um, is dissociation. And so those two patterns were causing my wife and I a lot of problems. So I was going to a lot of therapy for this. This is an example again about how you get self-blame, because it seems like, well, I have this, problem. And I just went to so much therapy for it. Nobody gave me the right word for it. Through years and years and years of dissecting it and understanding rejection sensitivity dysphoria, I, was able to pinpoint that's what I was experiencing. I'm able to not dissociate as much. But something that happened semi recently between my wife and I was, in the moment, I finally was able to recognize this is what I'm experiencing in that moment. And so I said out loud, I'm experiencing RSD right now. And my wife quickly said, well, it's not even about you. It's not even personal, which is the nature of RSD. And I logically can hear what she's saying. Logically, I understand it, but it doesn't matter because neurologically, I'm experiencing RSD. It's a part of my brain. And so I'm still going to have that experience. But what it made the difference for us was it takes out that personal aspect. It's no longer personal. So previous to this, we would get into these kind of, he said, she said, or she said, things, or, how it is in a relationship. Well, you're always having this response and so when I was able to say, this is what I'm experiencing, it takes out that personal aspect. She knows it's not about me. It's not about her. It's just the way my brain is wired. And so she was able to step away and give me my preferred, the way I prefer to deal with RSD, which is to not be perceived. And I was able to move through that without any, personal things from either one of us. And then we were able to circle back to what we were talking about later. So that is life altering.
Yeah, because you're going from I'm having this behavior, therefore I
Yes,
am bad, to
yes,
I'm having this behavior because. Uh,
yes,
And give me space, right? Let me process through it because it's not about you or it's not
yes,
about me. It's about the
yes,
way that I'm programmed and I'm
yes,
learning to deal with this.
yes, yes. And that is life altering. Um, because life is about relationships. And so it's changing my relationships in so many ways. That was an example about personal relationships. That was just the first one that came to mind when Zach asked that. But
And I think that's so interesting because you have also this same relationship with your daughter, and your daughter is also dealing with her own diagnoses and understanding and learning as a young person how to process through that.
mhm.
So, what were some of the early signs to you as a mom that said maybe I need to reach out for some support for my daughter? Now that you kind of have this hindsight, right?
Yeah, my daughter's story is I feel like interesting, but however, not unfamiliar to the neurodivergent community. And that's one thing I really want to highlight with my book and with my work is that to other families that are dealing with this, that like you're not alone, but also I think this experience is more common than we're really led to believe, just without the right lens. And so my daughter came out of the womb just screaming. And she'd never stopped screaming from birth till 13. She never rested. She never slept. She never had any peace at all. Everything was a struggle. Everything was hard. Um, it was just hard. And at 2.5, one of her first sentences that she kind of strung together was that she wanted to kill herself. And that is shocking to think of a 2.5-year-old, saying that. That was not the first time. She said that for from pretty much from the time she could talk until she was 13. Every day, life was that hard. And so while it's shocking, it also, in hindsight, does kind of make sense because it was that hard for her to live. And she really couldn't live through it. And so I tried everything, to save my daughter's life. I did everything you can imagine. I always say I did everything you can imagine, and then some things you can't imagine, because until your child is struggling to live, everything's hypothetical. You do not know what you will do, and so I just exhausted every resource, and um, we just flew under the radar. I don't really know how to explain it exactly. In part, another big part of the work that I really, want to do is to let people know that people that look like us are autistic and struggling and have ADHD. But, I think that was in a large part how we flew under the radar. But plus, I didn't have the right words. And so I was trying to describe this to people, providers. And I don't know, we just weren't getting uh, in part, the system is woefully underprepared for us. And I mean that in the nicest way possible. It just is. And so we just weren't receiving the right kind of information or lens. And I work in healthcare. And my wife is the director of behavioral health. So like we also have a lot of access to care that a lot of people don't. And I recognize that. So we were getting also good care, as far as it goes. Um, but it wasn't helpful for us. As a matter of fact, it was harmful.
And don't you feel like, as a teacher, I encounter a lot of different students with autism and ADHD or neurodivergencies,
Hmm.
um, and it's very different in girls and in women than
Yes,
it is
yes,
in um, individual males with these same
yes. It's
diagnoses,
not that they
and
don't have struggles. I totally, acknowledge that.
they have
But it
different
is,
struggles.
yes, it is definitely different. Yes. And so,
And
yes, there are many reasons I think we flew under the radar. But those are definitely two of them for sure.
And masking, right? Because that's something as
Yes,
women that we do a ton. We tend to mask our
sure.
emotions or
Yes.
push through and
Definitely how I was able to, one other reason I was able to fly under the radar all those years. Yeah.
yeah.
Um, when you were describing kind of your daughter's experience,
Hmm.
the only word that I can kind of use to like capture what you're talking about is torture. Um,
Yes.
and is it safe to assume that things aren't that way now that there's been a diagnosis?
Yes, I can tell you the rest of the story for her. So when she was 13, I got this crazy idea because, like I said, I tried everything. I exhausted every resource. When she was 13, we were driving to school one day and she was struggling. And I was listing off every possible thing that she could do. Like, again, like we've already done all these things, but I'm like therapy, art therapy, hypnosis. I'm like throwing out, everything. And she's just like, I'm not doing those things. I hate them. If you try to make me, I'm not going to get out of the car if we go, etc. And I said something like, well, we've got to do something because it just has to feel really bad to feel this bad every day. And she looked at me with just this gutted, like the only way I'd ever seen my child. Just her whole body at this point was covered in self-harm marks. Her face was just like devoid of life. Like she was so just broken and hollow and dejected. And she said, Mom, I've never felt good. And like the weight of the world just landed on my shoulders because I was like, she's right. Like, she's right. Like, she hasn't had one single moment of peace like her entire life. And so I got this crazy idea that somehow that IV ketamine was the answer. And so I searched the country and I found a provider that would treat pediatric patients with IV ketamine. I drove across the country and my daughter received 8 IV ketamine infusions at 13. That did not help. As a matter of fact, it just didn't. And um, about 2 weeks later, my daughter threatened somebody with gun violence at school, which, as you know, is very serious. And so at that point, I became somehow even more desperate. It was like the weight of the world shifted to like the weight of the universe. I just felt like a cornered animal. Like I felt like I had to do just anything to, save my daughter's life. And I, as part of my obsession with healing, I read probably no less than 1,000 self-help books and parenting books. And I had just read a book by a psychiatrist who has a couple clinics in the US that does something that's kind of controversial in the psych world, which is using a functional imaging scan of the brain to see what's going on in there. So it's psychiatry, but they're also looking at the brain. That approach just made sense to me. So I put it on a credit card, just as I have been doing for everything else. I'm just trying to, get my daughter to live. I drove across the country again and got my daughter's brain scanned. And that saved her life, without a doubt. Like I have no question in my mind that so when they looked at her brain and did her intake, they were kind of like, holy heck, like this kid has like the most severe case of ADHD that you can have. And so that approach saved our, my daughter's life. And that's how I found out that she had ADHD and then that I had ADHD and then that we were autistic eventually. But that's very common, going back to what you said, Nancy, for mothers specifically to be trying to help their children and then on the back end be like, oh, heck, this is weird. Something's very familiar here. So that's a very common story um, for women that have flown under the radar that are trying to help their kids.
So you guys get this diagnosis, and I say you both, and you guys, you ladies,
There was some
you're
time in
both.
there, but yes,
Yes,
yes.
you receive this diagnosis. What do you do? How do you proceed forward? And how does your relationship shift with your daughter?
Well, thanks to my own neurodivergence, um, when I heard that, I became obsessed with learning about ADHD. I became like really hyper focused on it. That was kind of a little bit of a pun. Anyway, that I became hyper focused on ADHD. But that's when I started reading everything. Like, it's impossible to talk to me for more than like 2 seconds and I'll be like, this chick has ADHD. And so I knew that, but I didn't understand that if your brain wiring is wired, differently, your brain's controlling everything. And so every single thing about you is impacted. It's not just your attention and your hyperactivity. Every single thing about you is impacted. Everything, the way I sleep, the way I walk. And so when I started reading about it and I learned about RSD, executive dysfunction, um, neurodivergent meltdowns, PDA, even like T-Rex arms, like which my daughter and I both have. I was like, what is this? Like, what's happening? Like, why didn't anybody tell me this up until now? Because it wasn't for lack of me going to providers of all kinds, not just traditional, but even non-traditional. I mean, I saw everybody, naturopaths, psych, Chinese medicine, hypnotherapist. I saw every kind of therapist. I mean, I did it all, and nobody mentioned these things. Um, so that was really shocking for me.
I would say that it would be shocking, in particular because just as a woman myself, I don't have an ADHD diagnosis, but I call myself type A. I think Zach can confirm I'm high energy and I like to get my things done off my to-do list and things
Mm-hmm.
just so.
Mm-hmm.
But I also know how hard I crash, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because when
Mm-hmm.
I go down hard. And I think for myself, it's that extreme, right? But it's the extreme between being hyper focused and fixated on finding the pursuit of the answer or the solution to the problem. But
Mm-hmm.
to me, that also, and then the exhaustion that comes from fatiguing yourself that there's nothing left, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it's that I just have to go crash out in my bed and just
Mm-hmm.
go away from everyone. But you really can't do that as a mom and as a parent, and especially if your child is what you said, threatening self-harm, threatening harm to others. How do you move forward? What did you do?
Well, I will say too, one slight difference in like neurotypical and neurodivergent, like as far as like what you're talking about is I was exhausting myself. Like you're saying, you exhausted yourself, but you got the list done. Like you got the list done and then you crashed out. That's great. But for me, I was like exhausting myself, but I was not getting anywhere. So I was like exhausting myself, but also like having no results. Like I kept going to therapist after therapist after therapist and just saying like, I was a poster child. Like I've done everything. And so, receiving the diagnosis, I know Zach kind of asked this, was, just all kinds of emotions. Um, but one thing was, I didn't have to keep trying so hard to fix something that I wasn't going to fix. That was both a gift, but also like really hard because I had spent a decade like spending like dedicating my life to changing myself. And so then to be like, oh, April Fools, you can't change this. It was like, it was freeing, but also it was like, no, wait, I want to keep it was really hard to be like, I'm not going to change these things. It was really distressing to know that like, this is just the way my brain works. But it was evident because if anybody was going to feel better, it was going to be me. I mean, um, it was very evident that like I had tried everything and it made complete sense. Like, oh, of course this isn't fixable because I'm not fatally flawed. If it was fixable, it would have already been fixed. Like some of the stuff would have worked. And I'm
Yeah.
sorry, I don't think that directly answered your question, Nancy.
That's okay.
Um,
Okay.
I think this is really interesting. I love like talking about the power of like understanding yourself. I think a part of that also comes down to like once you know, like, and as you said, like this is a part of you, but like you don't have to fix it, but you can accommodate it
Yes.
or treat it in some circumstances. And so, what kinds of things are you and your daughter doing to kind of accommodate your neurodivergence or your even maybe maybe treatment doesn't work, but what have you changed?
Yeah, I think our cases were, I mean, I don't know, see if you can rate it. But in our case, we were like at the end of ourselves. So we had to change our whole entire freaking life. I mean, we weren't like, oh, we'll have to like start relaxing on weekends. It was not that. It was, we had to change our entire lives. My daughter is not able to attend in-person school. That is not something that she has, that just outweighs her abilities right now. I am not able to work. Working was my own personal, um, just, I can't even describe how horrible it was. Everything was horrible. Working was particularly hard for me. I was good at it. I excelled in many ways. Um, and I always give this caveat that I also worked good jobs. I only say that because I think if you're working really hard jobs, then it is easy to say like, oh, work is hard. My jobs, I had really good jobs. I did great things. I worked with great people. I helped institute programs that are really important in my community. I managed grants, but I cried every single day at every single job. Sometimes the whole entire day I was there for 10 solid years, every day, nonstop, basically. Um, and so it was really difficult for me to accept that I am not able to work in a traditional sense. Um, and my wife really grasped that once we understood kind of what we were dealing with. My wife really grasped that before I did. And so she quickly made adjustments in our life, and had to be, I would say, a little firm with me that like you can't go back to the life that you had because it was killing you. Um, and so yeah, we had to change every single thing about our life. That didn't happen, overnight, and it wasn't easy, but it did change our lives for the better.
So,
As a oh sorry.
no, please go ahead.
As a physically disabled person, I can relate to that a little bit. I've definitely done a lot of working full time. But for me it was teaching. And like I was a high school English teacher for about 5 minutes. And I loved it. I loved the work. I loved the kids. Um, and like in a lot of ways, even as a newer teacher, like it was obvious I was going to be good at it. But anybody who's ever been a public school teacher knows that's long days, especially as an
Hmm.
English teacher that
Hmm.
has to grade papers after school. And after a while, I quickly realized, look, my body can't handle this. This is not something I was built for. I'm not eating enough. I'm not sleeping enough. If I try to do this, I will die. And so it just became not worth it.
Yeah, I didn't, I don't know if you guys want me to go into the condition that I got into in burnout, or not, but, eh, um, so, during the course of all this time, when I was doing all these things and my daughter began to feel better and, I began to feel worse and worse, over time. And I got to a point where basically I was also just disabled. I was unable to function in any sense of the word. It took time. So it's difficult to explain. It's also difficult for people to look at me and fully grasp this. And so it was really difficult for me to find care during this time, but I was unable to function. I just slowly became unable to talk, walk, think, speak. I became catatonic, and I couldn't do anything. My wife was caring for me 100%. I luckily was able to use the bathroom on my own and could usually feed myself if she brought me food, but that was it. And meanwhile, I was going to every doctor that you can imagine. And not only were the doctors saying, like, you're great, like nothing's wrong with you, but they were also saying, and furthermore, like you're doing everything I would tell a patient to do. There's not one single thing I would even suggest that you do. And again, I was not only just seeing traditional providers, but I was also seeing like every kind of non-traditional provider. And I just was getting worse and worse with no answers really. And I bought a $12 book on Amazon that was about autistic burnout. At this point, I had been told that I was autistic. I still wasn't fully even like believing it totally. Um, and when I opened the book, it was like reading my autobiography. It was not even just like a little bit similar. It was like verbatim, word for word, things I was saying out loud and experiences I was having. And so this is one reason I really know that neurodivergence is real. And, unfortunately, autism, has become kind of um what's I don't know the right word.
Politicized.
Politicized, yes, but also um sensationalized. That's the word I was looking for. And so in my experience, I spent a decade trying to do everything that would be a neurotypical approach. I mean, you name it, I tried it. Nothing helped. And that led me to ultimately being completely unable to function. And so once I realized that I was autistic and that I was in neurodivergent burnout, and I applied those principles by changing my life and changing every single thing about the way I exist, guess what? I began to feel better. And slowly over time, I stopped crying every day. And then something else weird happened. I started laughing instead of crying. And then I started looking forward to the future. And I was like, what the heck is this? I didn't even know that was like real. I thought it was just something like people said, like a saying. And so that's how I know that this is what I'm experiencing, because every neurotypical approach didn't work and harmed me, and every neurodivergent approach helped me, and now I live a different life. And so there's not really much denying that. That's one reason I wrote the book. When you read the book, that becomes really painfully obvious that there's no other answer really. There's nothing else you can say. Um, and so that's definitely another like piece of my work, if that makes sense in there.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I've met a lot of people with disabilities, neurodivergent, physically disabled, intellectually disabled, you name it. And in my experience, the most harmful thing a person with a disability can do is not accept themselves as a person with disability and embrace that and then receive whatever accommodations they need. Like the more
Mhm.
they try to live an air quotes normal life, the more they're disabling themselves.
That is my experience to a T, Zach.
If you're just turning in, you're listening to I Am Able Iowa, and we're talking with our guest today, Lish Greiner.
Griner.
Greiner. I knew I
It's a
was going to
trick.
do it
It's a
wrong.
tricky one.
It's the EI.
Yes.
Lish Greiner. Lish is a late diagnosed neurodivergent adult. She's also the parent of a neurodivergent child. She's an author, an educator, and really she's just an all around passionate person who is drawing upon her own lived experience to help others find vocabulary, clarity, and compassion on their own neurodivergent journeys. And so we're just very pleased to have you here and to engage in this discussion. I want to kind of pick up off what
Sure.
Zach was just talking about. He was talking a little bit about, not accepting you for who you are, right? Or seeing your diagnosis or your disability as being something that is needing to be fixed or repaired, not necessarily just being a part of who you were, and maybe requiring an accommodation that allows you to access your best life, right? And so that's something that I think is really in tune with the whole theme of the I Am Able show. We like to highlight the ability and disability and amplify and elevate stories. And so I kind of want to talk about this idea of, you go and you go and you pursue. I mean, you are a very, very good student. It is obvious. Like if you found a possibility, you chase that rabbit down the hole, right?
Yes,
Um,
yes,
but in doing so, it was almost as though you were trying to fix yourself and never could find the answer. And the answer
correct.
actually came from no longer seeking that path, but
Yes.
accepting who you are, right?
Hmm.
With the help of a medical diagnosis. And so I just am really curious about that. My son is currently clinically undiagnosed. And so I feel oftentimes like we're pursuing, answers that may never come.
Hmm.
How long? So 10 years, you're trying to find these answers and you
Hmm.
get them, you get this diagnosis. Not only are you ADHD, hyper focus, I'm assuming, but then also you're now autistic. Um, did you feel like you talked about, kind of feeling like you had answers, but it didn't seem to necessarily make you well, right?
Exactly. Yes. Yes.
And for your daughter, it seemed like as she improved, you yourself deteriorated. So that's obviously such a challenge. You're raising a parent. You don't know. I mean, none of us have a handbook for parenting, right? We're just
Correct.
doing the best we can. Um, and so you said to your daughter, you just need to try harmful, or try harder, and that was so deeply harmful. Um, when you're talking to your daughter now, what's your messaging like?
It is much different. Since I felt like I had to try harder, I felt like that was the answer for her too. And
Mhm.
many providers, suggested that as such. Um, but now our lens has totally shifted, because, I was trying to try harder to fix things that were never going to be fixed. And so, um, our messaging now is just more around staying regulated, um, and that's when we can be more in our thinking minds and make better decisions, but that once you're dysregulated, all bets are off. That's not a learning moment, which is hard for parents. I yes, I often talk about the parenting handbook because we're just handed the wrong ones, because I read every parenting book out there and I tried every approach, and those approaches were harmful because if you're giving a I was never really good at punishments, but let's just say even you're doing a punishment, but you're punishing somebody like for the way their brain works, but also like they don't want to be that way. I've had that experience myself. I didn't get punished for it, but when I'm experiencing executive dysfunction, I want to do the thing as much as anybody else. And so, it doesn't make sense to apply anything, a reward or a punishment, because that's not what's happening up there.
You talked a little bit about like you going from crying to laughter and then
Hmm.
hoping for the future. And you
Hmm.
mentioned that your daughter post diagnosis started to improve. So like what's her life like now? Or
Well, she definitely still is neurodivergent. She still has
of
ADHD. She
course.
still has, her own set of struggles. And but in changing, my life, we made a lot of changes to her life too. A lot of things slowed down, a lot of expectations changed. And so that also changed her life. And so she was able to find some nervous system regulation that she never experienced from birth to 13. If she just never had that in her body, like any kind of safety, because her body, her system was constantly elevated, constantly perceiving threats, constantly meeting up against these expectations that weren't realistic for her. And so and this is all when I talk about it, I feel like I make it sound like it happened like overnight. It did not. It was a very slow process, but just having a space where she could just have any amount of peace was life altering. Um, I tell this story in my book. When she began to feel a little better, I had spent her entire life, 13 years, more or less, bracing for a life without her. Because when she wanted to die, like she wanted, I mean, she could not live this way. And so I had spent most of my life bracing, or most of her life bracing for that time. I just thought there was no way she could make it out. I didn't see the other side. And I was completely burdened and racked with this thought of, I can't imagine my child dying and never having known a moment's peace. I was just absolutely racked with that thought every day. It's what kept me getting up at 4 a.m., kept me doing all the things, reading every book, trying everything, driving across the country for IV ketamine. And when she began to feel better, I thought, oh my gosh, even if she does not make it, at least she's had a little bit of peace. And that was just that weight of the universe that I felt like was on me, like began to lift. And it was just the most freeing feeling that you can imagine. I mean, she definitely still has her struggles, but it is nothing like what we experienced before we understood.
Right. That makes perfect sense. Um, maybe a more direct question is she had mentioned to you before that she had never had a good day.
Yes.
Um, is she at least having good days now?
Yes, yes. And I mentioned that she's not able to do in-person school. Um, and I never ever thought I am one of those I am one of those neurodivergent people that just excelled in school. And so I never ever ever thought that I would have a child that I would be, encouraging to not attend in-person school and just take a different route in life. It's one of those things I think that we've kind of talked about where, it seems like you have to graduate high school, you have to go to, you have to go to school every day. And but freeing up that space for her, not having to be weighed down by the everyday demands of like that she just can't maneuver, of being at school, having to worry about what you're wearing, having a teacher be in charge of you, all those things that were just draining every ounce of life from her body because she was not able to do it. Once they were lifted, it freed up some space, her spoons or internal resources to be able to socialize in a lot more effective. I don't think that was right, but she's able to have friends and be social in a way she never was. I mean, we never thought that would be possible for her. And she's really flourished socially in the last like year or so because I mean to me because she's not weighed down by something that was outweighing her ability. It was just draining every ounce of life from her body.
You've talked a lot about the book that you've been working on. Your memoir is entitled "Living in the Straw House That Neurodivergence Built," um, and it's really what it sounds like is not only survival and discovery, but it's how to reconstruct your life once you know. Um,
Yes.
and so, what was that moment that you thought in all of this chaos of your own diagnosis and your own kind of burnout, and that of your daughter's diagnosis and kind of rebirth, let's say, did you think, I know, I'll go ahead and throw myself into the process of becoming an author and writing a book and getting it published? What inspired that
It's so
moment?
funny. I saw on the list of questions that said, was there like anything in your life that like before would have been like a clue, which is like basically everything in my life. Like there's not one single part of my life that isn't like, why didn't anybody else see this or me or anybody? But so as is with neurodivergent people, one day I was like, I'm going to write a book. And I sat down here at this table and I wrote 17 books and I did not get up. I didn't clean anything. I planted a garden and I never went back out there the whole summer. Everything just grew like crazy. And I was just like, I'm going to write a book. And I just sat down, I got hyper focused on it. And that's all I did for like 2 months straight. Um, so that is, that is such a typical neurodivergent experience that I would just be like, no, I'm just going to write a book. And then that's all I do. And so, um, but another part is that, I worked in healthcare, I worked in psychiatric, um, care. And once I learned all these terms and saw how it changed our life, and I started to speaking to some other people, just people that I know about the traits or, about what it looks like and feels like to have alexithymia or RSD or, executive dysfunction and how that's perceived in our healthcare system, but just like what it looks like and feels like to you inside and to others from the outside looking in. And people just had no idea. And I know that's true because I worked in a psych office and we never shared any of this information. And so that was another piece of why I feel almost desperate to get this information out there, if that makes sense. Because if there's any family that's out there struggling the way we did, even if it's just one person that reads this and is like, oh my gosh, this is so helpful, then that's worth it. Like we have to start getting this information out there and have the right, vocabulary.
You mentioned alexithymia. You've done a great job describing some of the other acronyms and diagnoses that are accompanying your neurodivergence. What's this
Yeah.
alexithymia?
I'm so glad you asked about alexithymia because it is one of the most impactful traits. I mean, I don't know if I can say that I'm always like saying, well, this one's a big one, but I had so much trauma and so much horror around this particular trait. And it actually starts about 6 or 7 years ago. It's one of the very first like real clues. But my wife started saying that I wasn't connecting with her. I had no idea what she was talking about, and I was pretty offended. And I was like, yes, I am connecting with you. And this went on and on and on. And eventually I started Googling for like, how do you make sure that your spouse knows that they're connected? And so I'd memorize everything it said, and I would ask the right questions and say the right phrases. And lo and behold, she would just keep saying that. And I would be like, I know you're wrong because I actually Googled all the phrases and I'm saying them word for word. so,
Look at me
so
trying.
yeah. And well, it didn't end there. I started going to therapy for that. Um, um, it became like a test I was studying for. Like emotional intimacy became my obsession. And so, or finding my emotions, because that was what I was told, was like the core root of this. It seemed like I was the problem. Like I wasn't accessing my emotions in some way. And so that did become kind of clear. And so then I started working at that. And so I held up that emotion wheel every day for 18 months and I stared at it and I tried to write down my emotions and I wrote down the same three emotions every day. And I just got really ticked off because I never felt any of the other emotions. And so all kinds of providers suggested all kinds of things, trauma. They blamed my wife. They blamed my mom. One, like a spiritual provider I was seeing said, I must be feeling things. I'm just not like, I'm scared of what, your reaction. I'm scared of people's reactions to my feelings. So I should just kind of, get over that and just say whatever I'm feeling. And so I took that to heart. I and I kept trying to excavate all these feelings. And, seeing a psychologist for like a year straight, I was going there. This came up at every single session. And not one single time was the word alexithymia mentioned. And so that is so frustrating to me that if they would have just given me that as a possibility at some point, I could have looked into it and been like, oh my God. And so after I got diagnosed as autistic and was understanding autism, I found this word, alexithymia. And when I tell you this was probably the most shocking part of my whole entire journey, when I found the word alexithymia, I was like, you got to be freaking kidding me. I have been out here searching high and low, doing everything to try to find my emotions, and it turns out that I just have alexithymia. that that like I'm trying to open this like locked door that like isn't even locked. Like what? That one was probably the most one that shocked me. I've got to be honest.
Do you mind defining it for us?
Yes, I'm sorry. So alexithymia, broadly speaking, is a delay or an inability to feel, um, to feel or connect or like be able to talk about certain emotions. I experience it pretty profoundly. And what I have learned through a lot of therapy is that I don't always or often feel feelings. I often logically think feelings. And so that's a really finite difference that takes a lot of time to like really dissect because first of all, I thought that's how everyone felt feelings. I didn't know that that was something, anything different. But it was so harmful to me. Um, and so recently, one of my neurotypical children, who's like in their 20s, was struggling through something with emotions. And she was saying, could this be because of my trauma that she's experienced? Could this be because of some medication that she's on that maybe she's just blunting like her feelings? And I said, it could be either of those things. But let me just throw out this word to you because she was also sounding a lot like me, but and I don't know. But that's the whole point of having the right vocabulary is that I said, well, let me just explain alexithymia. And then you have a whole picture of the things it could be. And it's kind of up to you to work through that and figure it out. But you need to have it on your radar because if you don't, then you end up like me.
And that inability to emote or express your emotions, obviously that was part of what was creating the challenges in your relationship, whether
Yes.
it was with your spouse or your daughter, right? Who potentially in her own experience was having difficulty because of her dysregulation, identifying any other feeling or emotion other than misery, correct?
Yes. Yes. A lot of people with alexithymia describe a delay and I of like feeling emotions like maybe like 2 or 3 days later you're like oh that was hurtful or something. I do experience that some. Moreover, I experience a lot of like I just don't feel that in the same way. And so what was happening with my wife, who is neurotypical, which is weird, but is that she was looking for like a neurotypical response to emotions and those kind of things. And when she wasn't getting them, it felt like absence. It felt like a failure on my part. It felt like something was wrong. And so that has changed our relationship now that she knows, like, I'm just not feeling it the same way she does. She's no longer looking for those like emotional responses from me. And it doesn't feel like a failure. It doesn't feel like something's missing. It doesn't feel personal. It just is like, oh, that's just the way Lish's brain works. Yeah.
And how validating that must be.
That one was super validating. That one was just, that was the one that like really, like, I was just like completely shocked.
And you've talked a little bit about this. Obviously, people with neurodivergence, you can, you said about self-blame.
Mm-hmm.
I also think with self-blame, and I know a lot about self-blame, comes shame,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yes,
And
yes.
you internalize those things. And that can lead to that dysregulation, the
Mm-hmm.
meltdowns, the
Mm-hmm.
trauma,
Mm-hmm.
perpetuates misunderstanding. Um, is that what really drove you to write these books and workbooks? Was that you really wanted to bring this out into the open and provide resources for people? I think it was, there's that saying, there's no disinfectant like sunlight, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. I feel like when we don't tell these, stories, that we just are, it doesn't help our system change. It doesn't help our system be more prepared for us, and it doesn't, you know, um, yes, it relieves some of the shame, but also helps us know that we're not alone.
And to me, that almost seems like the most important part, right? I mean, you want to heal yourself. But relationships with others are such an important part of who we are as people, right?
Yes.
And because now you have this common framework, language, common understanding, as you said, the common vocabulary, right? I would think that it just allows you to facilitate those relationships on such a different level, right? Not only with your family, but with your colleagues and your friends, your neighbors.
Yes, 100%. Just having the understanding the vocabulary, it kind of goes back to what Zach said earlier, but has been life altering. There has not been one other single thing that has been more impactful than just understanding and having the right words.
Words are so powerful, right? They really do
Hmm.
help us build bridges, repair and mend broken fences. Um, but I also think it allows other people to drop their own mask, right?
Hmm.
And recognize that they don't have to appear normal. That we're all just, I mean, you guys saw it when I came on. I was taking my one hat off and putting my other one on. And just by telling you what I was doing, you were able to express empathy and understanding. And we were all just able to be more accepting, right? Um,
Hmm.
so it kind of makes me think of that idea of like that radical compassion, right?
Hmm.
How important it is that we all demonstrate that radical compassion. So, can you talk just briefly before the close of our show? What does that radical self-compassion mean in this context of neurodivergence?
That's hard to talk about quickly, but that has also it's tough. We live in a society that is just like, you should be able to do this, you should be able to keep doing all the things. And so, having the understanding and that leading to compassion has been life altering, but it's also tough because I still want to, I still have that ingrained in me that, whatever it is that's like, I shouldn't be compassionate about this. I should, buck up and just, do it. And I know that would end, poorly. But and so that's still a challenge, every day. My wife is really good at helping with that. And I've gotten a ton better at it. And it definitely has changed my life. But it's hard work being self-compassionate.
And for those who are listening and they really want to find your work and learn more about your memoir or access your Wired Differently series, where can they go to find all this amazing information that you've put together in your summer adventure at the kitchen table writing your grand masterpiece?
Yes. Um, I the book is coming out on Sunday, so the day after this show airs. So I'm excited about that. It will be on Amazon. You can find me at neurodivergentcompass.com. That's my website. All the information will be there, and I'm on Facebook at Neurodivergent Compass as well.
Lish, I just want to thank you so much for being on the I Am Able show today. You really have brought such interesting topics to the forefront and to the table.
Thank you.
Zach, do you have any last questions before we close on out?
I just want to say it was great to meet you. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. It was really great. I appreciate it. I appreciate you guys you had really thoughtful questions, so I really appreciate it.
Well, we love having this conversation, and amplifying and elevating voices is what we do. This is KHOI, Story City Ames, and you've been listening to the I Am Able Iowa show. I Am Able Iowa airs on the first and last Saturday morning of the month at 9 a.m. on KHOI 89.1 FM. You can also hear us streaming live online at khoifm.org. We invite you to share comments, questions, and program ideas with us at doug@thearcofiowa.org. And if you visit www.thearcofiowa.org, you can find previous episodes and more information about our program. I Am Able Iowa is produced by the Arc of Iowa, headquartered in Des Moines, Iowa, with local chapters here in Ames and across the state of Iowa. Until the next time, this is Nancy Baker Curtis and Zach Meekum saying, You are Able Iowa.